We've spoken a great deal about Calvin Coolidge's era and his views on the issues of his day, and even wondered what Coolidge might think about contemporary public policy issues. But today we'll go back into Coolidge's own background, and in particular, some troubling years he spent in Washington when things didn't seem to work out for him and when tragedy struck his family. Part 2 of our Coolidge Biography series is next on The Coolidge Way. I'm Jim Douglas, four-term governor of Vermont and big fan of our 30th president, Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge was a thoughtful man. Taking his perspective on governmental do's and don'ts, we'll evaluate today's important challenges. And we'll always ask, what would Coolidge do? This is The Coolidge Way, proudly presented by the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. In our last episode, Governor Coolidge had just dealt with a crisis, the Boston police strike of 1919. Rather than muddle through, Coolidge risked his career by acting decisively against a powerful group, the Boston Police Union. At that time, Massachusetts governors were elected annually, so a botched crisis could well have meant the end of Coolidge's political career. But Governor Coolidge did not let his personal ambition prevent him from doing what he believed was right. Public servants couldn't or shouldn't strike because their job was servant. The public sector was not the same as the private sector. Coolidge wagered that honoring principles was more important than political expediency or his own career. Here is Coolidge living history performer Tracy Messer, quoting from a letter that Coolidge wrote to his father.
People applaud me a great deal, but I am not sure they will vote for me. Never mind. I am glad to do it. The result won't matter to me, but it will matter a great deal to the rest of America.
Coolidge's decision to act on principle paid off, even for him. Come November, he won re-election to the office of governor easily. Many voters supported his handling of the crisis, and not just voters in Massachusetts. Throughout the country, the name Coolidge was suddenly being uttered. When Coolidge drew the line on public sector wildcat strikes, other politicians realized he was right. Those politicians included the sitting president, Woodrow Wilson. The Wall Street Journal wrote, "Governor Coolidge has shown the fiber of which presidents ought to be made." Coolidge's supporters sure didn't squander the opportunity. Fellow Amherst alumnus Frank Stearns raced to complete a compilation of Coolidge speeches, which would now include the strike telegram. Stearns saw to it that Coolidge's speeches would reach a national audience. He helped ensure the distribution of 75,000 copies of the volume. After shifting on titles, the men settled on the same title Coolidge had given his key 1914 speech, Have Faith in Massachusetts. Let's stop a minute here and think about that title. Would President Biden publish a campaign book called Have Faith in Delaware? Would President Trump publish a campaign book called Have Faith in New York? What's interesting about Coolidge's title is that it reminded a nationwide audience that we are a nation comprised of states. States matter and can lead Washington. It doesn't always have to be the other way around. Coolidge did one more key thing while still Bay State governor. The bureaucracy of the state of Massachusetts had been expanding for decades. It fell to the governor to prune, and dramatically. Soon Coolidge published his Big List, his government cutback. Under the Coolidge Big List, state employees lost their jobs and their departments, and they were furious at Coolidge. In retrospect, Coolidge recalled that the Big List, the big cutback, was tough work. At the Republican convention in Chicago, the party chose Warren Harding of Ohio as its presidential nominee and Coolidge for the vice presidential slot. The Coolidges were probably disappointed, but the platform of the Republican Party in 1920 paid respect to the very kind of government Coolidge liked to practice, restrained. Normalcy was the motto for the GOP in that presidential campaign. It was time, Harding and Coolidge were saying, to return to the pre-war status quo. America was facing inflated budgets as a result of the First World War. Taxes were so high that businesses slowed down their operations. The government owned too many assets, energy reserves, for example, that might be better managed by private hands. Normalcy won Harding and Coolidge the election, but the Coolidges found it hard to become accustomed to their new normal life in Washington. Part of the problem was the vice presidency itself. and the vice president's task of presiding over the United States Senate. Coolidge was a meticulous parliamentarian, and he found the Senate both wild and cavalier.
At first, I intended to become a student of the Senate rules, and I did learn much about them, but I soon found that the Senate had but one fixed rule, subject to exceptions, of course, which was to the effect that the Senate would do anything it wanted to do, whenever it wanted to do it.
The Senate was home to another very senior Massachusetts man, the imperious Henry Cabot Lodge. Lodge made no pretense about his contempt for Calvin Coolidge, a non-Bostonian. Lodge actually said, quote, "I've known Calvin Coolidge only as long as it has been necessary to know him." In the Senate, Lodge didn't like being bossed around by the younger Coolidge and made life for the rookie difficult. The Harding normalcy had its early successes, including the passage of a law that created a dedicated budget bureau. That bureau was the ancestor of today's Office of Management and Budget. Harding launched a string of tax cuts that would ensure the prosperity of the United States in the 1920s, no easy task in a time of big spending. But the second family continued to find Washington personally difficult. The Coolidge's new home, the Willard Hotel, offered luxury, but for bad pets. That was a great disappointment to the animal-loving Grace and Calvin. Mrs. Coolidge, in the end, befriended a mouse that emerged from the wall at mealtimes. The vice president's son, Calvin Jr., wrote a bitter poem about the vanity in Washington. The boy titled the poem Success. It goes, "Success, O magic word, success, how much you mean to happiness. Men seek you o'er airy land, but scanty few have you in hand. Men say untruths for you alone, and by foul means you're called their own. Yet rest not till their dying day, because they grasped you in such way." Worse still, especially for the proper Coolidges, was the iffy behavior of President Harding and his friends. President George W. Bush has sometimes spoken about why scandal matters. It matters because presidents enjoy only a certain amount of political capital. Scandal reduces presidents' store of capital and their ability to enact meaningful laws. Coolidge feared that this was what was going on with Harding. Prohibition was the law, yet liquor flowed at the White House. If the president broke the law and drank, then the country could break the law and drink too. If the party and the president were going to argue for handing responsibility to the private sector, they couldn't do that in a corrupt way. Yet Harding's cabinet, or their friends, were giving sweetheart deals to their friends on leases of Navy oil reserves. Such action besmirched not only Harding, but also the very notion of privatization. The uneasy vice president, of course, didn't know all or even most of the details of these transactions, but he suspected them and grew concerned. Purgatorial as well was that the Coolidges found they had to ship their boys off to boarding school so that they themselves could attend diplomatic parties, which, to Coolidge, who often suffered from stomach aches, could be agony. Add to that, every morning, the firing of a cannon at Fort Myer across the river from the Willard Hotel started the new day. "How I hate that sunrise gun," Coolidge commented. In late July 1923, Vice President Coolidge returned to Plymouth Notch to see his father and enjoy what remained of the Vermont summer. The Coolidges were trying to give their sons a normal life. Older son John was in a military preparedness program, Boy Scouts with rifles, at Camp Devens. Calvin Jr. worked in a tobacco field in Hatfield, Massachusetts, part of the Coolidge effort to be sure their boys understood regular life. Another boy on the farm said to Calvin that if his father were Calvin Coolidge, he wouldn't have to pick tobacco. "If my father were your father, you would," Calvin replied. Harding had begun experiencing health problems earlier that summer, and Coolidge was being kept abreast of them in Plymouth by telephone, a major advance at the time. Late on the night of August 2nd, there was a knock on the door of the Coolidge homestead. The vice president's father, John, answered and quickly called Calvin downstairs. There he learned the news that Warren Harding had died. The shock of losing a respected friend must have weighed heavily on Coolidge, but more daunting was the enormity of the task now before him, assuming the presidency of the United States. After some phone calls, a press statement, and a telegram of condolence to Mrs. Harding, it was time to initiate a presidential transition. His father, John Coolidge, a longtime notary public, administered the oath of office to his son by kerosene lamp, while Grace and a handful of others looked on. The simplicity and humility of the circumstances of Coolidge's inauguration would mirror the kind of president he hoped to be. And while the Coolidge administration on that evening was a faint notion, Coolidge himself was prepared for the challenge ahead. "I believe I can swing it," he remarked as he departed the Notch for Washington, the topic of our next show. Before we bring in the guest for today's episode, it's time for our Calvin Coolidge Pop Quiz. Here's the question. Which other politicians are many people with the name Coolidge related to? Think that over, and we'll have the answers at the end of this episode. I also want to take a moment to let you know how you can get in touch with us. Send us your thoughts on this episode at coolidgefoundation.org/The Coolidge Way, or by visiting our social pages on Facebook or Twitter. We'd love to see your comments and any ideas you have for future episode topics. Government is tough, especially when personal tragedy strikes, as it did to the Coolidges a bit later in their time in Washington. Case in point, when Coolidge was president, his son Calvin Jr. passed away at just 16 years old. Since this episode is about Coolidge's family and his troubles in Washington, we've invited a Coolidge family member to join us. Jennifer Coolidge Harville is the great-granddaughter of President Coolidge, and we're thrilled to have her on the podcast. She speaks frequently to audiences in New Hampshire and Vermont about the Coolidge family. Ms. Harville lives in Westmoreland, New Hampshire, with her husband David, their son Jake, and daughter Sheridan. One of her passions is choral singing, and she's a member of the Brattleboro Concert Choir in Brattleboro, Vermont. She's a graduate of Gettysburg College and earned a master's degree from Emory University. Jennifer Harville, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Jenny, what's it like to grow up in the family of a president? After all, there aren't many of them.
This is very true, and it's a delight, and it's such a unique experience because I've been part of the Coolidge family since I was an infant, basically. I always grew up knowing about the Coolidges and about their stories, so I have been to Plymouth all my life for at least once a year, if not more than once a year, learning about the Coolidges, learning about Calvin specifically, going through the buildings at the site were always very insightful, and just listening to the volunteers tell the stories about the Coolidges. I've always really, really loved being part of this whole story. And I think it's very unique, and I think it's important to keep sharing with others. There's another part of me who has just been a stay-at-home mom, so I'm not experiencing Coolidge on a daily basis, but that's okay because it makes it all the more special when I am able to get together with board members to talk about Coolidge and to think about ways that we can spread the message of the wonders of Calvin Coolidge and how he did such a great job.
We've been learning about the president's biography in this series of podcasts, so tell us about his immediate family.
So he had he married Grace Goodhue, and Grace Goodhue was from Burlington, Vermont. They noticed each other in Northampton, Massachusetts. Grace Goodhue was a teacher at the Clark School for the Deaf. After they got married, they had two sons. First, they had John, who was born on September 7th, in 1906. And he lived a nice long life to the age of 93, passed away on May 31st. 2000. And then Calvin Jr. Came along about 19 months later after John, and he had a much unfortunately shorter lifespan. He died in July 19th, 1924, and he was only 16 when he passed.
It's tough to lose a child at any stage of life. It must have been devastating to the Coolidges. So tell us about the reaction of the family to young Calvin's death.
Sure. It was very difficult. Of course, the young Calvin he was playing tennis on the tennis courts with his brother and with a couple of the White House physicians. And Calvin was not wearing socks under his shoes. And so they were playing at the end of June, 1st of July, and then he wasn't feeling well the following day. And Dr. Boone came in to check on him and discovered that he had a substantial blister on his toe and became in a high fever. Became very, very concerned about this. And so they decided they needed to really take action and take him to the doctor. This basically then started a week-long fight for Calvin Jr.'s life. There were ups and downs. He would feel better, and then he would not feel so well again. Basically, what happened is the blister was infected, and sepsis took over his body. This was before the days of penicillin, which penicillin was not to be discovered until 1928. And of course, this was 1924. So he passed away a week later after playing tennis. He passed away at Walter Reed Hospital on July 7th. I think his parents dealt with the death very differently. I think it was very difficult for the president or for Calvin Coolidge to deal with it. He would probably was suffering much internally. I would say he probably was suffering from some depression. He would sleep more. He had more disinterest in what was going on around him, and he put more stress and negativity on his remaining son, John. They had never been very close, unfortunately. And now with the passing of his younger son, it was hard for him to communicate with his son. So after that, but then Grace, she was very faithful and full of her religion, and she was able to deal with the grief through her faith. And I'll actually just read a poem that she wrote as a result of Calvin's passing. This was the way she dealt with his death. The title is The Open Door, and it reads, "You myself have shown me God. Your kiss upon my cheek has made me feel the gentle touch of him who leads us on. The memory of your smile when young reveals his face as mellowing years come on apace. And when you went before, you left the gate of heaven ajar, that I might glimpse, approaching from afar, the glories of his grace. Hold, Son, my hand, guide me along the path, that coming I may stumble not, nor roam, nor fail to show the way which leads us home." So very different ways of dealing with the grief of their younger son.
What a wonderful poem, a great tribute to young Calvin Jr. It must have been very difficult, of course. It's hard to be in the public eye when your family is suffering. At the same time, the Democratic National Convention was underway. 1924 was an election year, of course. The president was running for a term in his own right, and the convention called a halt when it learned that young Calvin had died. Now, your great-great-grandfather, John Coolidge, was in Vermont at the time. Communication wasn't as immediate and flexible as it is today, and he reportedly learned that his grandson had died by listening to the radio. How do you think he reacted to that?
That must have been very crushing for him. I know that the entire family loved to go up to Plymouth to visit Colonel John Coolidge and do lots of farm work up there. There were times when Colonel John would go down to to the White House as well later after Calvin was inaugurated, and he would visit there. But it must have been very, very difficult to hear that one of your grandsons had passed away. I can't imagine then how he was able to follow up with his son and console him. I believe he actually did go down, from what I understand, he did go down right away to Washington, D.C. to be whatever comfort he could to his son just by being there. But I think it was still very, very difficult for Calvin Coolidge and to deal with. I read that apparently my grandfather, John Coolidge, said that the only time he had ever seen his father cry was at the funeral for Calvin Jr. So he was really very fond of his younger son. So it was difficult for him to deal with it.
We're chatting with Jenny Harville, great-granddaughter of Calvin Coolidge. Jenny, your grandfather was John Coolidge, the sole surviving son of the president. Now, he married into a political family too, didn't he?
He did. So he met my grandmother, Florence Coolidge, on the train actually down to Washington for the Calvin Coolidge presidential inauguration in 1924. He apparently had met the governor of Connecticut and learned that he was in another car on the same train. So he asked to call on the governor and was eventually able to get back through to see the family. But to his surprise, there had been a change in the administration. So this was also an introduction. So John was able to meet the new governor of Connecticut. This was John Trumbull and his family. Their younger daughter was Florence, and he learned that she was attending Mount Holyoke. And so that led to him calling her after they had gone back to college. She did not believe that he was calling. I don't know why that would have been, but I think she was tickled that he called, and it led to them courting and dating, and then eventually becoming engaged. The president called her Miss Connecticut, so he was very fond of Florence.
Well, we're happy that they met by happenstance on that train to Washington, D.C., because otherwise we wouldn't be having this conversation, would we? Well, Jenny Harville, great-granddaughter of Calvin Coolidge, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts and recollections about the Coolidge family.
You're very welcome. I've been happy to join you and talk about him.
We've heard about some sad times for the Coolidges in the 1920s in this episode, but Coolidge did indeed soldier on and perform in the presidency in astounding ways subsequent to the death of his son. In this way, Coolidge was like Abraham Lincoln, who prosecuted the Civil War after the death of his son. We'll get to these topics in the third part of our biography series, Presidential Success and the Coolidge Legacy. The Coolidge Way is a production of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation with offices in both Plymouth Notch, Vermont and Washington, D.C. Special thanks to Coolidge living history performer Tracy Messer, who read some important quotes from our 30th president. If you have any thoughts, questions, or comments on this episode or any other, please don't hesitate to send me a note at coolidgefoundation.org/The Coolidge Way or on one of our social pages. Earlier in this episode, our Calvin Coolidge Pop Quiz asked you this question: which other politicians are many Coolidges related to? Well, the answer is a number. I myself am related to Calvin Coolidge, I discovered recently. So were both Presidents Bush. George W. is a sixth cousin a few times removed from Coolidge. But some Coolidges, though not the president directly, are related to Thomas Jefferson. In fact, it was those Coolidges, the Boston ones, whom the hoity-toity Henry Cabot Lodge knew well. I'm former Vermont Governor Jim Douglas. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us for another episode of The Coolidge Way.